demographics. I've spent a large part of my career measuring the personality traits of lawyers, both in the US and in other countries. I have a lot of data from Europe. And Richard asked us to talk about similarities and differences. And most of the story I have to tell today is about similarities. And in that sense, surprising similarities. So I can't speak to the other professional service firms as adeptly as I can about lawyers. Lawyers have certain personality traits that are atypical. So I use a tool called the Caliper Profile. It measures 18 distinct personality traits. It's been normed for countries all over the world. It's been used in 32 different countries. And these 18 traits are normally used by everybody to a greater or lesser extent. Each trait on a scale of 0 to 100 averages at the 50th percentile. And there's a range. If you take any occupation, it's not going to be exactly 50, the average for each trait for the occupation. It'll be somewhere between 40 and 60%. But there's one profession, which is the legal profession, that defies that standard. And 7 of the 18 traits, lawyers score either below 40 on average or average score above 60. And that's just astonishing. That's 7 more traits than any other occupation. So I want to talk about how these traits, especially certain of them, make us similar. There are 2 points here. One is that we're very similar between European countries and the US. And number 2 is that these traits are very relevant to leadership, some of them. So first, to the similarities. What has always struck me is while there are many differences in values, differences in traditions, differences in many things, between people from Europe and people from the US or North America, for that matter. When we look at lawyer personality traits, the 7 traits I'm about to summarize for you are indistinguishable. I could not, if I looked at a profile and saw somebody's scores, I couldn't tell you what country they were from. I could tell you lawyer or not lawyer much more readily than I could tell you what country they're from. So what are these atypical traits? Number 1, lawyers have an average skepticism score that's off the charts. In some firms, it's well over the 90th percentile, where for the public, it's always going to be 50 for each trait. Being skeptical is part of thinking like a lawyer, and that's what makes people with high skepticism enter this profession. While we're on that subject, so lawyers here and lawyers across the pond, very similar in their high levels of skepticism. But here's the challenge. Practicing law requires skepticism. The opposite of skepticism is trust, and the practice of leadership requires trust. In fact, empathy is one of the components of building trust. And so it's very challenging when somebody is both a lawyer and a leader and has to vacillate between these 2 roles. It's like having one hand in fire and the other in ice. The second trait is high autonomy. Lawyers have extraordinarily high levels of autonomy, almost as high as skepticism, in the sense that lawyers, first of all, do not want anyone telling them what to do. And secondly, lawyers, because of the nature, the structure of the practice of law, are very often left to their own devices. No one's supervising them or breathing down their neck for the most part. They are given wide latitude in making decisions about many things. And so this attracts people with high needs for autonomy. Again, a very good thing if you want a happy career and you have high autonomy, go into law. But again, when we come to leadership, high autonomy is not so good, because it makes us a little bit too independent to create teams and a sense of we. Number 3, lawyers are high in abstract reasoning. The main reason that people enter the legal profession is because they like solving problems and they like using their high levels of intelligence to feed their large brains and to stimulate them and to do things that are intellectually challenging. Which is fine, unless you do too much of it, in which case it becomes a little bit annoying to some people. It can devolve into analysis paralysis. And it also can lead to a lot of joy in arguing just for the sake of arguing. Lawyers in the audience right now are thinking, no, that's not right. Let me tell you why you're wrong. The number 4 trait is urgency. Lawyers are elevated in the degree to which they want to get to the finish line. They're not patient. They're not content to be where they are now. They want to be where they're going. And so this is probably a trait that's attracted into this profession because the clients that lawyers serve are almost always coming to lawyers because they have some very pressing problem that needs solving. And so they want their lawyers to solve it yesterday, and lawyers feel that pressure. And so it doesn't surprise me that people with a high dispositional sense of urgency enter a profession where that kind of urgency and responsiveness is required. Number 5 rather, is low sociability. The people that enter this profession are very private and don't really prioritize relationships or intimacy. And in fact, often they devalue them or trivialize them. We often hear lawyers saying, oh, relationships, eyeball roll. Now, here we go, we're getting into touchy-feely territory. And that was charming and playful back in the 80s and the 90s. But we now have so much accumulated scientific data that social connections, authentic social connections, are not only not trivial, but they rise to the top of the prediction ladder in terms of being among the most significant predictors for all of the outcomes that human beings want. Satisfying lives, satisfying workplaces, longevity, physical well-being. Social connection is a predictor for all of those things. So we're kind of misplaced to continue that attitude of trivializing relationships. Number 6 is surprising to people who aren't in the legal profession because it's something that you only see when you're up close with lawyers, and that is lawyers have the lowest score in a trait called resilience of any occupation whose data have ever been published. High resilience is somebody who, in the face of criticism or rejection, tolerates it well, and when it does get under their skin, a criticism, for example, they bounce back quickly. Low resilience people are very thin-skinned, are always defensive, or often described by others as insecure. They worry a lot. They feel wounded very easily. In fact, really low people, my favorite example of low resilience is we're walking down a street and we pass by a high-end clothing shop, and I look in the window and I say to my lawyer colleague, look at that outfit in the window. You'd look smashing in that outfit. Well, it's a compliment, right? So most people would say thank you. But a low resilience person says, what, you don't like what I'm wearing? So that's low resilience. And then the last thing is tying back to what Francesca said. These 6 traits I've mentioned so far have always been outliers in the close to 30 years I've been measuring these traits. It's only the last 3 years that empathy, is particularly cognitive empathy, the use of the intellect and figuring out what do you need, what's the experience you're having, how is what I'm going to say going to land. Those kinds of empathic calculations are very important, as Francesca underlined. They're important in leadership, they're important in client development and retention, they're important in collegiality, they're important in a whole bunch of things in any professional services firm. 2 points. First, empathy has been dropping like a stone around the world. There are several studies on this. There's one major study in North America showing, it's about 10 years old, but it shows that empathy among millennials has dropped 40% compared to the previous cohort, which is just an astonishing statistic. Number 2 is empathy is one of the most learnable personality traits. So it can be improved. Cognitive empathy in particular can be improved, but it is, in my experience and from my data, very low, both here in the US and in Canada, where I've measured it, and I've measured 7 or 8 countries in Europe. So